Who are you going to call? I recommend the Game Shop to inquire about refund policies. Yep, episode 91 of NES Works is haunted by the specter of the Ghostbusters. Much like the EPA, I'm deeply unamused. Like Spy vs. Spy, Ghostbusters is another well-loved classic computer game that got done dirty on NES. Like a lot of people who grew up playing NES, I blame my experience with games like this for my ingrained skepticism of American-developed software and tendency to gravitate toward Japanese creations. In hindsight, I've come to realize that doesn't really treat the US side of the industry fairly. Ghostbusters may be a ragged wreck of a game, but the blame for its shortcomings falls largely on the head of the Japan-based portion of its creative equation. The original version of Ghostbusters appeared on Commodore 64 as one of the first games designed by Activision's David Crane upon his migration from the failing Atari console market in favor of the relative prosperity of the PC industry. Crane had just completed development on Pitfall's impressive sequel, and Ghostbusters saw him eagerly embracing the creative possibility of his new artistic palette. Rather than revolving around a single little man running and jumping his way through the wilderness, Crane's Ghostbusters takes place in Manhattan and puts players in control of the entire Ghostbusters team. Well, at least in control of the founding members. Taking all the wrong cues from the movie, late diversity hire Winston Zeddemore never appears in the game in any capacity. In its C64 incarnation, Ghostbusters was a little messy and overly ambitious, but it held up well against contemporary PC releases and did a remarkably good job of translating the essence of the film, if not necessarily its plot beats, into digital form. Considering the circumstances of its creation, its coherence feels like something of a miracle. The theatrical success of Ghostbusters had taken the executive team at Columbia Pictures by surprise. Promoted as a minor throwaway comedy novelty flick in the vein of Caddyshack or Tank, it instead became the second most popular film of 1984. A lot of that success had to do with Ray Parker Jr.'s infectious title theme, which took a patently ridiculous premise, added a memorable call and response element that drove home the property's name, and played it all perfectly straight. Parker vamped in the studio over a catchy hook, clearly having fun with the material, without ever crossing the line into making fun of it. The film couldn't have asked for a more effective advertisement than for a chorus of singers to belt out its name several times in a row on top radio stations. The music video didn't hurt either, landing during peak MTV and treating audiences to precious snippets of film footage back in the days before YouTube trailers. Shocked to find themselves sitting on an unanticipated goldmine of a media property, Columbia quickly hit the streets to license the Ghostbusters property to any and all takers. Among those takers was Activision, one of the few major game companies to have more or less weathered the video game apocalypse that was currently in the process of imploding console-focused studios across the country. Columbia's mandate to Activision amounted to a dream pitch for a popular media property. Create a game that makes effective use of the film's concepts, and do it however you like, because you guys know what makes a great game, we don't. The one downside, this freedom came about because the studio wanted a game out as quickly as possible to take advantage of the buzz around the movie. Granted, in those days, popular movies had lengthier theatrical runs than they do now, sometimes remaining in circulation for a year or longer, and then enjoying a second surge of popularity once they showed up on home video, or as a network-exclusive television broadcast 18 months later. Even so, Activision had to rush to adapt the film to computers, a process that tended to result in high-concept messes like E.T. for Atari 2600. Of course, having abandoned the 2600 by this point, Crane and the programmers who helped him assemble Ghostbusters had the advantage of working with more powerful hardware with relatively capacious memory and a more expansive interface than had been the case for Atari with its tiny memory and one-button joystick. Ghostbusters probably would have turned out to be every bit as abstract as E.T. had it been made for 2600, but it's a C64 game that luxuriated in technical opulence. It contains a city map, a shop and economy, gear that affects your ghost-busting capabilities, and multiple vehicular and on-foot action modes, all of which fit together, logically, in a way that simply couldn't have been achieved on 2600, or arguably on NES, which recreates these mechanics and concepts in a fairly disastrous fashion. Reduced to a mere specter of its former self, Ghostbusters on NES emerges as grotesquely as any free-floating, full-torso, vaporous apparition. Horrible to behold, best banished into a nuclear trap. The credit, or rather blame, for this conversion falls on the shoulders of a studio called Bits Laboratory, which specialized in console conversions of computer and arcade releases. Prior to Ghostbusters, Bits had converted a pair of Squaresoft computer releases, Dexter and King's Knight, to Famicom. Neither of those conversions changed anyone's lives, but as fairly straightforward action games that consisted entirely of auto-scrolling shooter action, Bits' console renditions fared acceptably well. Ghostbusters presented a much greater challenge too, an early example of multimodal game design. It combined what appeared to be a light, map-based business simulation with sequences centered around driving and character action. A session of Ghostbusters gives you about 30 minutes in which to build up the team's arsenal and prevent the resurrection of Gozer the Destroyer before New York's telekinetic energy level hits a critical threshold that manifests in the summoning of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. To that end, the crew drives their modded hearse around the city in order to capture ghosts that they transform into cold, hard cash. The action can be somewhat abstract without the assistance of an instruction manual, but it works once you have a sense of your objectives and your skills. The action begins on a simple grid map of NYC, with the Zool building at the center of the city. A set of 4 ghosts spawns constantly, one in each corner of the screen, and they immediately make their way toward Zool. The Ghostbusters themselves navigate the city in the form of the iconic company symbol, moving between 3 key destinations: the Ghostbusters headquarters to the south, and a shop and gas station in Uptown. The corporate symbol and Parker's theme song factor heavily into the game, but they do more than simply provide window dressing to transform a generic action title into a licensed product, as was so often the case in the 1980s. You couldn't really mistake this Ghostbusters game for any other property. You earn cash by capturing ghosts, and to capture ghosts you need to buy gear. You can buy nearly a dozen different items from the shop, although some of the more advanced items require an awful lot of ghost catching. The game gives you just enough cash on hand to acquire a particle beam, some traps, and a vacuum, which gives you just enough of a foundation to begin building your business empire in a vivid application of the phrase, "you gotta spend money to make money." Although you can encounter ghosts before you acquire capture gear, you lack the ability to interact with them. Once you've packed up the crew and grabbed the proton packs in their backs, however, you can snag ghosts in 2 different formats. First, you can head to infested buildings that flash red on the city map, where 2 team members have about 10 seconds to drop a trap and snag as many ghosts as they can. These scenes allow you to swap control between either character as they fire a beam directly into the air to paralyze a spook. You can alter the angle of the beam in a full arc, although this raises the possibility of crossing the beams, which will result in an instant failure for that mission and kick you back to the map with nothing to show for it. If you manage to line up some ghosts above the trap though, you can fire the trap and pull in every ghost it hits for big bucks. In what has to be a nod to Pac-Man, you double your score for every ghost you kill in a single shot: 200, 400, 800, and 1600 points. Each set of ghosts you capture fills a trap, which needs to be emptied at HQ before you can use it again. So you spend a lot of time driving back and forth to base, which is the other way you can earn extra cash. Every ghost symbol you pass over while navigating the city map appears in the driving scene that pops up every time you move between 2 locations. If you equip the Ecto-1 with a ghost vacuum, you can suck up as many as 4 ghosts per drive for bonus money that doesn't fill a trap. Sadly, that is the only appealing element of the road sequences, which otherwise turn Ghostbusters into a tedious drag. You have to navigate streets anytime you travel around the city, and the more you drive around before arriving at a destination, the longer you have to drive. Here's where the game begins to unravel. These driving scenes comprise the bulk of a Ghostbusters playthrough, but they contain exactly 0 variety. Every single sequence works exactly the same regardless of where you happen to be traveling to or from. You muddle down identical straight, undifferentiated stretches of street, with the only difference between driving sessions boiling down to how far you have to drive. New York is measured out by meters, and the more you move around on the map, the more meters you have to travel in the road sequences. Along the way, you need to avoid cars, which all exhibit the exact same behavior, drifting across lanes at identical angles, with collisions penalizing you a few $100s from your earnings. The ghosts you drive over on the city map appear here and can be suctioned up with the ghost vacuum. And every 100 meters, a fuel can appears, which you need to collect in order to allow your hearse to travel further. Run out of gas, and the team will push the car to the gas station on foot, which costs you time in which the PK meter climbs and, of course, money to top off the gas tank. The Ecto-1 has the worst gas mileage of any ground vehicle this side of those gantries that drive the space shuttle to its destination. A full tank will get you about 150 meters down the road. Between the monotony of the road, your car's punishing fuel consumption, and the seemingly endless succession of driving sequences, Ghostbusters' version of New York is absolutely misery to get around. What really kills the game is the fact that it's packed with unforgiving game overs that can instantly end the adventure at any point, many of which seem to be heavily loaded toward the game's finale. Run out of money at any point in the course of patrolling NYC, and it's game over. Allow the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to maraud its way through the city, and it's game over. Let ghosts touch you too many times while climbing your way to battle Gozer in the final Zool building, and it's game over. This is the part that really sucks. The final ascent to Gozer involves climbing a whole lot of stairs while ghosts hover above you. You can buy ghost food to act as bait and temporarily lure them to the side, and you can buy a special suit that allows you to endure a few extra ghost attacks. This doesn't change the fact that the process of climbing the stairs consists of making your team move slowly forward a step at a time by tapping the A button. Tap once and you move forward a step. Tap B and you reverse a step. Your Ghostbusters inch their way forward one button tap at a time as a sort of human centipede of futility. Ghosts lurk about randomly and erratically drift into your team, while you creep forward while desperately hoping the specters don't slam into you, as you have no way to avoid them. I suppose it's probably just as well that the game ignores Winston, since his presence would simply leave your formation even more vulnerable to attack. If you allow ghosts to make contact with you too many times, one of your teammates will die. Once all three die, the game ends. Should you, by some miracle, make it to the top of the building, you fight Gozer in a sequence every bit as cumbersome as the ascent. The final battle plays out as a primitive shoot-'em-up in which you control a pair of Ghostbusters firing energy beams at Gozer. All the while, Gozer fires energy beams back at you. Random ghosts drift around, absorbing your attacks, and bullets fired by Rick Moranis and Sigourney Weaver fill the screen. Manage to land enough attacks on Gozer and you win, but at what cost? Although Ghostbusters has a fairly positive reputation in its original computer incarnation, it's hard to describe this version as anything but wretched. Bad graphics, poor controls, terrible collision detection, and a general sense of surrender to the inevitability of technical compromise by bits makes for a real wreck of an experience. The movie that inspired this game admittedly hasn't aged entirely gracefully. A lot of its humor feels very much in keeping with the Reagan era. But even with its reliance on out-of-date jokes and perspectives, Ghostbusters, the movie, has some great concepts, hilariously deadpan exchanges between its cast members, charmingly corny visual effects, and some brilliant, memorable lines. The NES game does not have any of these things going for it, and its design feels as unhappily mired in the Reagan era as the film's most atavistic gags. Although the blame for many of its failings lie with the original concept assembled by Activision, the worst of its shortcomings rest on the souls of this version's developers. Thankfully, you don't need a nuclear accelerator to exorcise your NES of this curse, just a good grip with which to yank the cartridge from the control deck. Next time on NES Works, Capcom transforms the NES into the unhappiest place on Earth.